Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where ordinary people step into extraordinary darkness. Tonight we travel to Alaska, a land where the sky burns green and the ground swallows sound. There's something about the endless nights here, the isolation, the storms, the quiet roads that lead nowhere, that breed stories you can't quite shake off. What you're about to hear are real accounts and bone-deep legends from those who survived them, and from some who didn't. Make sure you subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next time the dark calls. Pull up your hood, take a deep breath, because once we start, the cold takes hold, and it's hard to get warm again. Story 1. Last train to White Pass the dead dawn, to rest on the White Pass Railroad. I learned this the hard way during my final shift as a conductor on the most haunted train line in North America. My name is Marcus Riley, and I spent 12 years working the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad between Skagway, Alaska, and Fraser, British Columbia. 27 miles of narrow-gauge track carved into mountainsides so steep they seem to scrape the belly of heaven. Most tourists see breathtaking scenery and gold rush history. I saw something else entirely. It started 3 months before I quit, during the last run of September. The train was packed with leaf peepers and history buffs eager to experience the route that carried 100,000 gold seekers through the Chilkat Pass in 1898. Normal crowd, normal day, until we reached mile marker 18, where the track curves around Dead Horse Gulch. That's when I saw him in car 3. An old man in a threadbare coat, sitting in seat 14A, staring out the window with eyes that reflected no light. Nothing unusual about that, except seat 14A had been empty when we left Skagway. I personally checked every seat during my pre-departure walkthrough. The passenger manifest showed no one booked in that row. I approached him to check his ticket, but when I reached seat 14A, nobody was there. Just the lingering smell of wet wool and something else. Something that reminded me of earth and decay. The seat cushion was ice cold despite the car's heating system running full blast. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly tourist from Phoenix, grabbed my arm as I passed. Her face was white as mountain snow. She whispered that she'd been watching the man for 10 minutes. Said he never blinked, never moved, just stared at the passing landscape like he was searching for something he'd lost long ago. When I asked her to describe him, every detail matched the daguerreotypes hanging in our employee break room. Images of gold rush prospectors who died on this route over a century ago. I reported the incident to my supervisor, Jake Morrison, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything the railroad could throw at him. He laughed it off, blamed altitude sickness and tourist nerves. But I noticed he avoided car 3 for the rest of the season. The second encounter happened in early October, during our final run before winter shutdown. This time, I wasn't alone in seeing them. We were climbing through the White Pass summit, elevation 2,888 feet, when our engineer Tommy Kozik radioed back from the locomotive. His voice was shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. He reported seeing figures walking alongside the train, keeping perfect pace despite our 15-mile-per-hour climb up a 40-degree grade. Men in heavy coats and worn boots, carrying pickaxes and canvas bags, marching through waist-deep snow that hadn't fallen yet. I moved to the observation deck of the rear car and saw them myself. Dozens of translucent figures trudging up the mountainside, following a path that paralleled our tracks. They moved with the determined gait of men who had walked thousands of miles for the promise of gold, but their faces were sunken and hollow, like they'd been walking for far longer than any human body could endure. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. Our breath came out in white puffs that hung in the air longer than physics should allow. Several passengers complained of sudden headaches and nausea. One woman fainted and couldn't be revived until we descended below the tree line. But the worst part was the sound, a low humming that seemed to come from the mountain itself, like hundreds of voices singing a funeral dirge just below the range of human hearing. It made my teeth ache and my hands shake. The sound followed us for 3 miles before fading as we approached Bennett Lake. I started researching the railroad's history after that second incident. What I found in the Skagway Museum archives made my blood run cold. The White Pass route wasn't just difficult to build. It was cursed from day one. Between 1897 and 1900, over 3,000 prospectors died attempting to cross the pass. Starvation, exposure, avalanches, and something the old reports called mountain sickness. That drove men insane before killing them. But those were just the official numbers. Local tribal elders spoke of many more who simply vanished, swallowed by the mountains and never seen again. The railroad construction itself claimed 43 lives. Workers fell from scaffolding, were crushed by rock slides, or froze to death during the brutal winters. But the strangest deaths were the 12 men who simply walked off the job site and disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind all their possessions and wages. Their bodies were never found, but search parties reported hearing voices calling from the mountain peaks, speaking in languages no one recognized. Then I found the conductor logs from the 1920s and 1930s. Entry after entry describing phantom passengers, unexplained temperature drops, and crew members who quit after single shifts. The railroad company quietly reassigned the most vocal witnesses to other routes and sealed the reports in their corporate archives. My final encounter happened on November 15th, during an employee training run before we shut down for winter. Just me, Jake, Tommy, and a new hire named David Cross riding the empty train through the pass one last time. We were descending toward Bennett Lake when every light in every car went out simultaneously. Emergency power failed. Radio communication died. Even our flashlights wouldn't work. We sat in absolute darkness, listening to the rhythmic clacking of wheels on track and something else. Footsteps, dozens of them, moving through the cars from front to rear. The phantom passengers had come aboard. I felt them passing by my seat. The temperature of their presence, colder than Arctic wind. The smell of unwashed bodies in desperation. The soft whisper of fabric against fabric as they moved through the aisles. But most terrifying was the weight of their attention. These weren't mindless ghosts. They were aware, intelligent, and they were looking for something. The footsteps stopped right beside me. I felt breath on my neck that carried no warmth, only the musty odor of graves. A voice spoke directly into my ear. So close I could feel moisture that shouldn't exist. It said one word. Mine. The lights came back on. The radio crackled to life. We were alone in the car, but seat 14A was occupied again. This time by a young woman in a Victorian dress. Her face blue with frostbite, staring out the window with eyes full of infinite sadness. She held a daguerreotype photograph of a man in prospector's clothing. I submitted my resignation the next morning. Jake Morrison was found dead in his office 3 days later. Heart attack, the coroner said, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror and his body was ice cold despite the building's heating system working perfectly. The new hire, David Cross, was discovered wandering the rail yards in a catatonic state, mumbling about passengers who wouldn't show him their tickets. The railroad still operates seasonal tours, still promotes the historical romance of the gold rush era, but they don't tell passengers about the additional travelers who board at mile marker 18. They don't mention the sudden temperature drops or the voices that call from the mountain peaks. They certainly don't warn anyone about the phantom prospectors who are still searching for the gold that cost them everything, including their eternal rest. I moved to Florida after I quit, bought a small house near the beach, as far from mountains and trains as my savings could take me. But distance doesn't matter when they've seen what they've seen. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the distant sound of train wheels on track and the low humming of voices singing funeral dirges. I wake to find my house cold as a mountain pass, my breath visible in the air, and the smell of wet wool lingering in rooms that should be empty. The dead don't rest on the White Pass Railroad, and once they marked you as one of their own, they never let you forget the price of gold and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Every ticket on that train comes with invisible passengers who paid their fare over a century ago and are still waiting for their journey to end. My name is Marcus Riley, and I am telling you this because yesterday I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a vintage railroad ticket for seat 14A on a train that doesn't officially exist. The departure date is tomorrow, and despite being 2,000 miles away, I could hear the whistle calling me home. Story 2. Ice Cave Reflections. My reflection waved goodbye to me in the ice, and I never waved back. I need to tell you what happened in Alaska before the nightmares make me forget which memories are real and which ones belong to the things in the glacier. My name is David Chen, and I am a professional cave rescue specialist from Colorado. 3 weeks ago, I was part of a team investigating reports of strange phenomena in a newly exposed ice cave system near Juneau. The glacier had been retreating for decades, but last summer, this heat wave accelerated the process dramatically. What emerged from the melting ice was a network of caverns that had been sealed away for thousands of years. The first exploration team went in expecting standard geological formations, What they found instead was something that challenged everything we know about light, reflection, and the nature of human perception itself. The initial reports sounded like typical cave fever, hallucinations caused by carbon dioxide buildup, disorientation from prolonged darkness, the usual psychological effects of underground exploration. But when 3 separate teams reported identical phenomena over the course of 2 weeks, the National Park Service called in specialists. That is how I found myself on a commercial flight to Juneau, carrying enough spelunking gear to outfit a small expedition. The other team members were professionals I'd worked with before. Sarah Martinez, a geologist from the University of Alaska, and Tom Bradley, an experienced cave photographer who documented systems around the world. We were confident, prepared, and completely unprepared for what we encounter. The helicopter dropped us at base camp just after dawn. The glacier stretched before us like a frozen ocean, its surface scarred with crevasses and melt channels. The cave entrance was a gaping wound in the ice, roughly 20 feet wide and perfectly circular. Meltwater trickled from its edges, creating a constant musical dripping that echoed from the depths. Our first descent was routine, standard protocol, safety checks every 50 feet, constant radio contact with the surface team. The ice walls were pristine, formed by centuries of pressure and freezing. My headlamp beam revealed crystal formations that sparkled like diamonds, and the temperature held steady at just below freezing. The first anomaly occurred about 200 feet into the system. I was leading the descent when my headlamp illuminated a section of wall that seemed different from the rest. The ice there was perfectly smooth, like a mirror, and in its surface I could see our team descending. But something was wrong with the reflection. The figure that should have been me was moving independently. While I raised my hand to signal the others, my reflection continued descending. When I stopped to examine the phenomenon more closely, my reflected image kept walking deeper into the cave. Sarah noticed it too. Her reflection in the mirrored ice was examining a different section of wall, following a path we hadn't taken. Tom started photographing frantically, but when he reviewed the images on his camera SLCD screen, the photos showed only normal ice walls. The mirror-like surfaces didn't appear in the pictures at all. We descended deeper, following a main passage that spiraled gradually downward. Every 100 feet or so, we encountered more of the mirror ice. Each time, our reflections behaved independently, exploring areas we couldn't see, interacting with the cave system in ways that defied physics. The most disturbing moment came when Tom's reflection appeared to be talking to someone. In the mirrored surface, we could see his reflected image engaged in animated conversation, gesturing and nodding as if responding to questions. But Tom himself was silent, focused on his photography. When we asked him about it, he insisted he hadn't seen anything unusual in the ice. That is when we realized the reflections weren't just moving independently. They were experiencing the cave differently than we were. 3 hours into the descent, we reached a chamber that took our breath away. The ceiling stretched up into darkness beyond our light range, and the walls were lined with the mirror ice in perfect geometric patterns. It was like standing inside a crystal cathedral, except that every reflective surface showed a different version of our exploration. In one section of mirrored ice, our reflections were fleeing in terror from something we couldn't see. In another, reflected Sarah was pointing excitedly at discoveries that didn't exist in our reality. Reflected Tom was photographing formations that weren't there, his camera capturing images of a cave system that seemed far more elaborate and ancient than the one we were actually exploring. The most unsettling reflection showed all 3 of us standing perfectly still, staring directly out of the ice with expressions of absolute horror. This version of our team had been watching us since we entered the chamber, never moving, never blinking, just observing with that look of terrible understanding. Sarah tried to take ice samples from the mirror sections, but her tools couldn't make contact with the surface. They passed through the reflective areas as if they were empty air, even though the ice appeared solid and our reflections interacted with it normally. The geological equipment registered normal ice composition everywhere except the mirror sections, which didn't register at all. We were documenting this phenomenon when Tom disappeared. One moment he was photographing the chamber, this central formation, and the next moment his headlamp was gone. No sound, no cry for help, just the sudden absence of his light. Sarah and I called out, our voices echoing strangely in the crystalline space, but received no response. That So when we looked at the mirror ice and saw the truth, Tom was there, in the reflections, but he was moving through a version of the cave that we couldn't access. We could see him descending deeper passages, photographing formations that didn't exist in our reality, following a path that led into sections of the cave system that weren't physically present. His reflection occasionally looked back toward where we stood, and we could see him shouting, his mouth moving frantically as if he was trying to warn us about something. But we couldn't hear him, and he couldn't hear us. He was trapped in the reflected version of the cave, exploring a mirror image of our reality. Sarah and I tried everything. We touched every mirrored surface, looking for a way to follow him or bring him back. We called his name until our voices were hoarse. We even tried breaking the mirror ice, but our tools passed harmlessly through the reflective areas. The most horrifying moment came when his reflection stopped moving. In the mirrored surface, we could see him standing perfectly still, staring at something beyond our view. His expression slowly changed from confusion to terror to a kind of resigned understanding. Then he looked directly at us through the ice and began backing away from whatever he was seeing. We never saw reflected Tom again after that. The ascent to the surface was a nightmare of paranoia and dread. Every mirror surface we passed showed different versions of our escape. Sometimes our reflections were running. Sometimes they were crawling. In one particularly disturbing section, reflected Sarah and I were descending back into the depths instead of climbing toward the surface. The worst part was that our own reflections occasionally looked directly at us with expressions of pity, as if they understood something about our situation that we didn't. As if they knew that the version of reality we were experiencing wasn't the real one. When we finally reached the surface, the rescue coordinator was waiting with Tom's backup equipment. He'd been monitoring our radio transmissions and was confused because we'd been broadcasting two separate conversations simultaneously. Our actual voices discussing the mirror ice phenomena, and a second audio track of Tom excitedly describing incredible formations and discoveries that we'd never seen. The official report classified the incident as a climbing accident. Tom was listed as missing, presumed fallen into an unmapped crevasse. The mirror ice phenomenon was attributed to unusual crystal formations creating optical illusions under headlamp illumination. Case closed, no further investigation required. But I kept Tom's camera. The photos he took show a completely different cave system than the one we explored. In his images, the passages are filled with elaborate ice formations, ancient symbols carved into the walls, and evidence of previous human presence. The final photos in the sequence show our team, but we were wearing different clothes and carrying equipment we never had. And in the background of several shots, other people are visible. Other exploration teams that supposedly never existed. They studied those images for weeks now, and they reached a terrifying conclusion. The mirror ice doesn't just show reflections. It shows other versions of reality, parallel possibilities where different choices led to different outcomes. Tom didn't disappear into a crevasse. He crossed over into one of those alternate realities, one where the cave system is more extensive and far more dangerous. The nightmare started a week after I returned home. In my dreams, I'm back in the glacier cave, but now I can hear Tom calling for help from inside the mirrored surfaces. He is trying to warn me about something, but I can never quite make out the words. And in every dream, my reflection is doing something I'm not doing, exploring areas I haven't been to, making discoveries I never made. Last night, I woke up to find muddy boot prints on my bedroom floor. They led from my bed to the mirror on my dresser and then stopped. The prints were my size, but I hadn't been outside in days. When I looked in the mirror, my reflection was covered in ice crystals and mouthing words I couldn't understand. I think the mirror ice followed us home. I think the reflected versions of ourselves are trapped in the glacier. I think we are. And every night, our real selves are trying to find a way back to the reality where Tom is still alive and the cave system contains wonders beyond imagination. The question that keeps me awake is this: if I am the reflection, and my real self is somewhere in the ice, what happens when he finally finds a way home? Story 3. Kesugi Ridge Files. I found the camera hanging from a birch tree like a Christmas ornament, 20 feet above the trail where no human could have placed it. My name is Jake Hartwell, and I am a search and rescue coordinator for Denali State Park. 23 years pulling lost hikers off mountains, and I've never seen anything like what happened on Kesugi Ridge last September. The official report says David Chen fell into a crevasse, but crevasses don't exist on that ridge, and they certainly don't hang cameras in trees. David was a software engineer from Seattle, 38 years old, experienced backpacker with over 200 solo hikes under his belt. He deregistered for a 3-day trek along the Kesugi Ridge Trail, a moderate 36-mile route with spectacular views of Denali. Standard stuff for someone with his experience level. He was supposed to check in at the ranger station by Sunday evening. When he didn't show, his emergency contact triggered a missing persons alert Monday morning. I led the search team that found his abandoned campsite on Tuesday. Site looked normal at first glance. Tent properly staked, sleeping bag neatly rolled, backpack organized with military precision. But something felt wrong the moment I stepped into that. The silence was too complete, like the forest was holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to avoid that spot. David, his hiking boots were placed side by side outside his tent, socks folded neatly inside them. His jacket hung from a tree branch exactly at eye level, arms spread wide like a scarecrow. Everything arranged with obsessive care that didn't match the scattered equipment of someone who fled in panic. Then I noticed the trees. Every birch within 50 feet of the campsite had been stripped of bark in perfect spirals, creating pale white scars that wound around each trunk from base to crown. The work would have taken hours with proper tools, but David carried only a small folding knife. I found gouges in the wood that suggested fingernails had done the stripping. We followed his trail for 2 miles before losing it at a creek crossing. The tracks simply vanished midstream, like he'd been lifted into the air. But we found something else that made my skin crawl. Footprints in the soft mud beside the water. Human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too long, too narrow, with impressions that suggested toes extended into claws. The prints paralleled David's trail for over a mile, staying exactly 20 feet to the left of his path, matching his pace step for step. On Wednesday, we expanded the search to include helicopter reconnaissance. That is when pilot Sarah Morrison spotted the reflection 12 miles off trail, hanging from that birch tree like a bizarre fruit. David's digital camera, suspended by its neck strap exactly 20 feet above the ground. The tree showed no signs of being climbed. No broken branches, no disturbed bark, no rope marks. The camera simply hung there, swaying in the breeze like it had grown from the wood itself. Retrieving it required climbing gear and 3 rangers working in shifts. The camera was intact, battery at 60%, memory card containing 47 photos spanning his 3-day hike. Beautiful landscape shots, wildlife pictures, standard vacation documentation. Until the final image, photo number 47 was a selfie taken at 3:17 a.m. on Sunday morning. David, his face filled the frame, but his expression was pure terror. Eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, face streaked with tears and dirt. Behind him, barely visible between 2 spruce trees, was another face. Human in shape but wrong in proportion. Too tall, too thin, with features that seemed to shift when you looked directly at them. Eyes that reflected the camera flashed like an animal, but with an intelligence that was uncomfortably aware. The thing was smiling, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any earthly mouth. They enhanced that photo using every digital tool available. Each time I zoom in, the creature becomes clearer but somehow less believable. Its skin appears to be covered in bark-like scales. Its hands, visible at the edges of the frame, and in claws that could strip bark from trees or flesh from bone with equal ease. The metadata told us the photo was taken at David's campsite, but we found no signs of struggle there. No blood, no torn fabric, no indication that anything violent had occurred. Just those spiraled trees and the obsessively arranged equipment. We brought in tracking dogs from Anchorage. The animals refused to follow David's scent beyond the creek crossing, whimpering and backing away from something they could smell but we couldn't detect. When we forced them toward the area where the camera was found, they became violent, snarling at empty air and trying to bite their handlers. The investigation officially ended after 2 weeks with David classified as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure or accident. But I kept digging through old files, talking to retired rangers, checking decades of incident reports. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Every 3 to 5 years, a solo hiker vanishes on Kesugi Ridge under similar circumstances. Always experienced outdoors people, always during late summer or early fall. always with equipment found arranged in unnatural patterns. The disappearances go back 40 years, but the files are incomplete, deliberately obscured by bureaucratic language that admits nothing while suggesting everything. In 1987, photographer Janet Mills disappeared while documenting wildlife migration patterns. Her camera was found in a beaver dam, containing images of something tall and thin stalking her through the wilderness for 3 days before the final, terrified selfie. In 1993, geologist Robert Kim vanished during a soil survey expedition. His equipment was discovered arranged in perfect geometric patterns across a half-mile radius, as if something had been using his tools to create a message in a language humans weren't meant to read. In 2001, botanist Maria Santos went missing while studying bark beetle infestations. Her notebook was found filled with increasingly frantic observations about trees that moved when she wasn't, looking in shadows that didn't match their sources. Each case followed the same pattern: solo hiker, experienced outdoors person, mysterious arrangement of equipment, and always, that final photograph showing the same impossible creature lurking just outside the frame of human understanding. I started camping on Kesugi Ridge during my off-duty hours, trying to understand what was taking people from my mountains. The first few nights were peaceful, normal autumn camping with nothing more threatening than curious squirrels and distant wolf calls. On the fourth night, I heard the trees moving, not wind rustling, but deliberate motion. The sound of bark scraping against bark as trunks twisted in their roots. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to an entire forest rearranging itself around my tent. When morning came, the trail I hiked for 2 decades had moved 30 feet to the left. The trees were different too. Older, taller, with bark patterns that hurt to look at directly. The familiar landmarks I used for navigation had vanished, replaced by features that seemed to shift when I looked away and back again. I found David, his body, on the 5th night. He was standing among the birch trees, perfectly preserved, wearing the same clothes from his final photograph. But his position was wrong, too straight, like a mannequin posed by someone who had never seen a human stand naturally. His eyes were open, staring at something behind me that I was afraid to turn around and see. When I approached him, his mouth opened and leaves fell out instead of words. His skin had the texture of bark, rough and grooved with natural patterns. His fingernails had grown into claws, stained with white sap from the trees he spent his final hours stripping. I ran, abandoned my gear, abandoned my pride, abandoned everything except the desperate need to get off that ridge before I became another arranged display in someone else's search report. The next morning, I submitted my resignation and moved to Phoenix. Desert living, where trees are scarce and the things that hunt in forests can follow. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of bark scraping against bark. I wake to find my houseplants rearranged in patterns that seem to spell out messages in a language older than human civilization. David Chen's final photo is locked in an evidence vault, but I made copies before I left Alaska. Every detail becomes clearer with time, revealing new horrors hidden in the pixels. The creature behind him I isn't alone. There are others, dozens of them, standing just outside the camera, this flash range. All watching, all waiting, all smiling with too many teeth. My name is Jake Hartwell, and I am telling you this story because yesterday I received a package with no return address. Inside was a digital camera, battery at 60%, containing 46 beautiful landscape photos from Kesugi Ridge. The 47th photo shows my own face, taken last night while I was sleeping, with that same impossible creature standing behind my bed, reaching toward me with claws that could strip bark from trees or dreams from sleeping minds. Some things follow you no matter how far you run, and some hunts never end until the prey stops running and accepts their place in the pattern. Story 4 to 1989 Bering Sea Ghost Ship. The voices in the fog knew my name before I ever told them. I am Captain Jake Morrison of the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, and what I discovered in the Bering Sea 35 years ago still wakes me up screaming. In October 1989, we received a distress call from a Japanese fishing vessel, the Hokkaido Maru. The transmission was garbled, filled with static and what sounded like multiple voices speaking in languages that didn't exist. Then the radio went silent. Our orders were simple: locate the vessel and render assistance. The Bering Sea in October is a graveyard of storms and ice, but we conducted hundreds of rescues in those waters. This should have been routine. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my 20-year military career. We found the Hokkaido Maru 3 days later, drifting dead in the water roughly 200 miles northwest of St. Lawrence Island. From a distance, the vessel appeared undamaged. Her nets were still deployed, engine still running, navigation lights still functioning. But as we approached through the thick fog bank that surrounded her, something felt fundamentally wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No radio chatter, no crew visible on deck, no response to our hail. The second thing was the smell. Even with the wind carrying it away from us, there was an odor drifting from the fishing vessel that made my stomach turn. Not the normal scent of fish and diesel fuel, but something organic and rotten, like seaweed left to decay in stagnant water. We launched a boarding party consisting of myself, Petty Officer Rodriguez, and Seaman Andrews. The fog was so thick we could barely see the Hokkaido Maru until we were alongside her hull. As we climbed aboard, our boots slipped on a deck covered in some kind of slick, dark substance that definitely wasn't seawater. The wheelhouse was empty but operational. The engine was running normally, the GPS showed their last recorded position, and the fish finder indicated a massive school directly beneath the vessel. But there was no sign of the 12-man crew anywhere on deck. That's when Rodriguez found the logbook. The entries started normally enough. Weather reports, catch tallies, routine maintenance notes written in neat Japanese characters. But the final entries, translated later by naval intelligence, told a story that still gives me nightmares. October 15th, fog bank appeared at dawn, thicker than anything they encountered. Radio communications becoming difficult, crew reporting strange sounds from the water. October 16th, fog has not lifted. Fish finder shows massive movement beneath us, but nets come up empty. Men are becoming agitated. They claim to hear voices calling from the fog, but in languages none of us recognize. October 17th, the voices are getting closer. They know our names. Tanaka says he heard his dead father calling to him from overboard. I ordered all men to stay below deck, but 2 are missing from the morning count. October 18th, more crew vanished during the night. The remaining men are terrified to sleep. The voices in the fog call to us constantly now, promising things they lost, people they loved. The words change depending on who is listening, but the tone is always the same. Come to us, come home. October 19th, I am the last one aboard. The others walked into the fog willingly, following voices only they could hear. I can see them sometimes, standing just beyond the rail, beckoning for me to join them. But they were wrong somehow. Their faces are too pale, their eyes too dark, their movements too fluid. I sealed myself in the wheelhouse, but I can feel something changing. The fog is getting inside my head. The final entry was written in English, in handwriting that became increasingly erratic. They read not voices from the fog. They read voices from below. The fog is just how they reach the surface. They've been waiting down there for so long, and they were so hungry for warmth, for life, for the memories that make us human. I can feel them pulling at my thoughts, sorting through my experiences like files in a cabinet. They know about my wife, my children, my fears. They relearning to be me. That's where the logbook entries ended. Andrews discovered the first body in the ship, as hold. The crewman was suspended in a web of what looked like seaweed, but under closer inspection proved to be some kind of organic filament that pulsed with its own rhythm. The man, his eyes were open but completely black, and his skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath the surface. He was still breathing. As we examined the body, more of the organic filaments began emerging from the walls of the hold. They moved with purpose, reaching toward us like blind fingers seeking contact. Rodriguez tried to cut through them with his knife, but the blade passed harmlessly through the substance as if it were made of water. The fog around the vessel began to thicken, and through it, we could hear voices. Not the crew of the Hokkaido Maru, but our own voices. Perfect mimics of Rodriguez, Andrews, and myself, calling out from the gray murk surrounding the ship. The voices knew things about us that no one else could know. Childhood memories, secret fears, the names of people we lost. Rodriguez was the first to crack. He heard his brother calling from the fog, the brother who died in Vietnam 15 years earlier. Despite our orders to stay together, he walked to the rail and climbed over without a word. We could see him for a few moments, walking across the water, his surface as if it were solid ground, following a figure that looked exactly like his dead sibling. Then the fog swallowed them both. Andrews lasted until we found the captain's cabin. Inside, we discovered what remained of the Hokkaido Maru's crew. They were all there, sitting around the small table as if in conference. But like the man in the hold, they'd been transformed. Their skin was translucent, their eyes completely black, and those organic filaments connected them to each other in an intricate network. When we entered the cabin, they all turned to look at us in perfect synchronization. Their mouths opened, and the voices that emerged were our own. They spoke in our accents, used our speech patterns, told us stories about our lives with perfect accuracy. But the words they chose, the emotions they expressed, were subtly wrong, as if something inhuman was trying to understand human experience and failing. Andrews couldn't handle it. He started screaming and didn't stop until he threw himself overboard, following voices in the fog that sounded exactly like his deceased parents. I was alone on the Hokkaido Maru for 6 hours before the fog finally began to lift. During that time, the voices never stopped calling. They offered me everything I ever wanted. They promised to bring back my father, who died when I was 12. They showed me visions of my ex-wife, telling me she still loved me and wanted me to come home. But I'd seen what happened to the others who listened. The most terrifying part wasn't the supernatural phenomena of the transformed crew. It was the realization that whatever inhabited the depths of the Bering Sea had been studying human beings for a very long time. The voices knew exactly what to say to break down our psychological defenses. They understood loss, longing, regret, and love well enough to weaponize them. When the fog cleared, I called for immediate evacuation. The Polar Star's crew pulled me off the Hokkaido Maru and we scuttled the vessel with depth charges. The official report classified the incident as crew abandonment due to carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty ventilation systems. The transformed bodies were never mentioned. But I know what really happened out there. Something ancient and hungry lives in the deepest parts of the Bering Sea. Something that feeds on human consciousness and memory. The fog is just its hunting ground, and the voices are its lures. I retired from the Coast Guard 6 months later and moved as far inland as I could get. But distance doesn't matter. Every few months, usually during heavy fog, I hear them calling. My name spoken in voices of people I loved and lost, promising reunion, promising peace, promising answers to questions I didn't I was asking. The worst part is that after 35 years, I'm starting to believe them. My wife died last spring. My children have families of their own. And I spend most of my time alone with memories that feel less real every day. When the fog rolls in now, those voices sound less like threats and more like invitations. Last week, I bought a boat. A small fishing vessel. Nothing fancy, but seaworthy enough to make the journey to the Bering Sea. I tell myself I'm going back to finally understand what happened, to get closure on the most traumatic experience of my life. But I know the truth. I'm going back because after all these years of fighting them, the voices have finally learned to say exactly what I need to hear. They were promising to show me how Rodriguez and Andrews really ended up, whether the crew of the Hokkaido Maru found peace in their transformation. They were promising to take away the loneliness. And God help me, listening. Story 5. Frozen screams of the Richardson Highway. I should have listened to the old trucker at the diner in Fairbanks. He grabbed my wrist with fingers like ice when I mentioned driving the Richardson Highway alone that night. His eyes wide with something that looked like genuine terror. But I was young, stubborn, and had a delivery deadline that meant everything to my struggling freight company. The Richardson Highway stretches 468 miles through some of the most desolate wilderness in Alaska. Mile marker 285 sits in a particularly lonely stretch where the road cuts through dense forest, 30 miles from the nearest town. That was where I first heard them, the screams. It was February 1997, and I was hauling machine parts from Fairbanks to Valdez in my Peterbilt. The temperature gauge on my dash read minus 42 degrees. The kind of cold that kills you in minutes if your truck breaks down. The kind of cold that freezes your breath before it leaves your mouth. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 hours when I reached mile 285. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the endless tunnel of spruce trees that pressed close to the road. That was when I saw the car. It sat 20 feet off the shoulder, a pale blue sedan from the 70s, nearly buried in a snowdrift. Nothing unusual about that. Abandoned cars dotted Alaska's highways like grave markers. What made me slow down was the thin layer of frost covering every surface. Frost that seemed to glow in my headlights with an unnatural brightness. As my rig rumbled past, I glanced in my side mirror. For just a moment, I could swear I saw faces pressed against the frozen windows of that car. 3 faces, 2 adults and a child, their mouths open as if they were screaming. I told myself it was just shadows and frost patterns. The mind plays tricks in the Arctic darkness. But my hands were shaking as I reached for my CB radio to report the abandoned vehicle to the state troopers. Static answered me. Nothing but white noise across all channels. The screaming started 5 miles later. It began as a whisper at the edge of hearing, like wind through trees. But wind doesn't to sound desperate. Wind doesn't to sound human. This did. 3 voices crying out in the darkness behind me, growing louder with each mile I drove. I pressed harder on the accelerator, my diesel engine roaring as I climbed a long grade. The screaming followed, echoing off the mountains, seeming to come from everywhere at once. When I checked my mirrors, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Frost was spreading across my rear window. Not the normal frost you get from temperature differences. This was moving, creeping across the glass in intricate patterns that looked almost like reaching fingers. And through that frost, 3 pale shapes were keeping pace with my truck, floating just above the road. My speedometer hit 70, 80. The speed limit was 55, but I didn't care. The shapes in my mirror grew clearer. A man, a woman, and a little girl, all wearing clothes from decades ago. Their faces were blue-white, their eyes black holes in their skulls. Their mouths stretched wide, and I could finally understand what they were screaming. Help us, please help us. So cold, so cold. I had heard the story before. Of course. Every trucker who ran the Richardson Highway knew it. The Martinez family, Carlos, Elena, and their 8-year-old daughter Sophia. They had been driving to Anchorage for Christmas in 1974 when a blizzard hit. Their car went off the road at mile 285. They were found 3 days later, frozen solid in their seats, the little girl clutched between her parents. But knowing the story didn't prepare me for this. The dead were following me, and they were getting closer. The temperature inside my cab began to drop. My breath started fogging despite the heater running full blast. Ice crystals formed on the inside of my windshield. The screaming grew so loud I could barely hear my engine over it. I grabbed my cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. The radio remained dead. I was completely alone on that frozen highway with 3 ghosts who had been waiting 23 years for someone to help them. That was when I realized my mistake. I wasn't running from them. I was leading them home. The GPS on my dashboard showed I was approaching mile marker 260. 25 miles from where I had first seen their car. They weren't chasing me randomly. They were guiding me back to where they died. Back to where they were trapped. I slammed on the brakes, my rig jackknifing slightly before the anti-lock system caught hold. The screaming stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of my engine idling and my heart hammering against my ribs. In the sudden silence, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing toward Valdez, I turned my truck around. If these spirits wanted to go back to their car, I would take them there. Maybe that was what they needed. Not rescue, but acknowledgement. Not salvation, but simply someone who cared enough to return. The drive back felt like descending into hell. The temperature continued dropping until my breath came out in solid clouds. Frost covered every surface inside the cab. The 3 figures appeared in my headlights now, walking ahead of my truck down the center line, leading me back to mile 285. Carlos walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. Elena held her arms wrapped around herself as if she was still trying to stay warm. Little Sophia skipped between them, occasionally looking back at me with those black hole eyes, her mouth moving in what might have been words of gratitude. When we reached the pale blue sedan, they stopped. Carlos turned and looked directly at me through my windshield. For the first time, his expression wasn't one of terror or desperation. He nodded once, a gesture of thanks, then pointed toward their car. I understood. I climbed out of my truck, the 40 below air hitting me like a physical blow. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached their vehicle. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see the truth. They were still there, 3 skeletons in decay-stained clothes, huddled together in death. Carlos had his arms around his wife and daughter, trying to share what little warmth remained in their final moments. The car's fuel gauge read empty. They had run out of gas trying to keep the engine running for heat. But there was something else. something that explained why they had been trapped here for so long. A thermos sat on the dashboard, still sealed. Next to it, a small wrapped present with a tag that read, "For Sophia, Merry Christmas. Love Mama and Papa." They had died on Christmas Eve, just 20 miles from the truck stop where they could have found help. I opened my truck and pulled out an emergency flare. As the red light blazed to life, casting dancing shadows across the snow, I placed it on the roof of their car. Then I bowed my head and said a prayer I hadn't spoken since childhood. When I looked up, they were gone. The crushing cold lifted. My radio crackled back to life, and dispatch was calling my number, wondering why I had been out of contact. But the story doesn't end there. I reported the location of the car to the state troopers. They recovered the remains and gave the Martinez family a proper burial in Anchorage. The local newspaper ran a small story about the discovery, noting that the family had been missing for over 2 decades. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 6 months later, I was running the Richardson Highway again. This time I wasn't alone. My partner Jake was riding shotgun, and we were hauling a load of construction equipment to Prudhoe Bay. When we reached mile 285, Jake pointed out the window. "Look at that," he said. Someone put up a memorial. Where the pale blue sedan had sat, 3 white crosses now marked the spot. Fresh flowers lay at their base, somehow protected from the wind and snow. But that wasn't what made me pull over. Standing beside the crosses were 3 figures, but these weren't the desperate, frost-covered ghosts I had encountered before. Carlos, Elena, and Sofia Martinez appeared as they must have looked in life. Warm, smiling, at peace. They waved as my truck approached, and I could swear I heard their voices carried on the wind. "Thank you," they called. "Thank you for bringing us home." Jake didn't see them. When I asked if he noticed anything unusual, he just shrugged and said the memorial was nice, and wasn't good that someone remembered them. But I know they were still there at mile 285, not trapped anymore, but watching, protecting other travelers who might find themselves in trouble on that desolate stretch of highway. Other truckers have told me about breakdowns at that exact spot where help arrived just minutes later, or about cars that ran out of gas but somehow made it to the next town on empty tanks. The Martinez family found their way home, but they never really left. They were guardians now, helping other lost souls navigate the frozen darkness of the Richardson Highway. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the aurora dances green and silver across the Alaska sky, I still hear them. Not screaming anymore, but singing. A Spanish lullaby that Elena used to sing to Sofia, carried on the wind through the spruce trees. And every time I pass mile 285, I slow down and flash my lights 3 times. Once for Carlos, once for Elena, once for little Sofia. The dead deserve to be remembered. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, they'll remember you too. The dark feels closer now, doesn't it? If you're still with me, hit subscribe and tap the bell. It's how we keep our small fire burning. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Alaska's shadows reach far. Story 6. Night shift. I should have listened to the locals when they told me not to take the night shift at the Petersburg cannery. But when you broke and desperate in Alaska, they ask questions about easy money. The old-timers at Murphy, Espar had been clear enough. Don, to work alone after midnight. Don, to go near processing vat number 7. And whatever you do, Don, to investigate the splashing sounds. But I needed that overtime pay more than I needed their superstitions. My first week went fine. The cannery had been shuttered for 3 years before reopening under new management. Most of the equipment was ancient, dating back to the 1970s when Petersburg's fishing industry was booming. The building creaked and groaned like an old ship, but that seemed normal for a place built on pilings over the harbor. The trouble started on my 8th night. I was doing my usual rounds, checking temperatures and making sure the refrigeration units were running properly. The cannery floor stretched out before me like a cathedral of rust and shadows, lit only by sparse fluorescent bulbs that flickered every few seconds. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to follow me everywhere. That's when I heard it. A wet, rhythmic splashing coming from the far end of the processing floor. I stopped walking and listened. The sound continued for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I told myself it was just water dripping from a leaky pipe. Old buildings always had mysterious sounds, but the splashing had a pattern to it, like someone struggling in water, like someone drowning, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of empty processing stations and conveyor belts that hadn't moved in years. The air grew colder as I approached the old processing area, and I could smell something metallic and rotten beneath the usual fish odor. Processing vat number 7 sat in the corner like a metal tomb. The circular tank was maybe 8 feet across and 4 feet deep, designed for cleaning fish before they went through the canning process. A thick layer of rust coated the rim, and dark stains streaked down the sides. The locals had told me a worker fell in back in 1983. Drowned in the cleaning chemicals while working alone on a night shift just like mine. I aimed my flashlight into the empty vat. Nothing but shadows and rust stains that looked almost black in the artificial light. But the smell was stronger here. Not just fish and chemicals. Something else. Something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The splashing started again, directly behind me. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight beam swept across empty floor, empty conveyor belts, empty processing stations. But I could still hear it. Wet sounds like someone thrashing in water, growing more desperate with each passing second. And underneath that, a scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across concrete. The sounds were moving, getting closer. I backed toward the exit, keeping my flashlight aimed at the processing floor. That's when I saw the wet trail. A dark line of moisture zigzagging between the machinery, as if something had been dragged across the concrete. The trail glistened in my flashlight beam, and I could see it was still wet. Still fresh. My radio crackled to life. The night security guard, his voice filled the empty cannery. "Hey, maintenance, everything okay down there? I'm seeing some weird temperature readings on the monitors." I pressed the talk button with shaking fingers. "Yeah, everything is fine. Just checking the equipment," but everything was not fine. The wet trail was getting longer, extending from vat 7 toward my current position. And the splashing sounds had changed. They were quieter now, more methodical. Like someone learning to move through water, like someone getting stronger. I decided to call it a night. Some overtime pay wasn't worth whatever psychological game my imagination was playing. But as I turned toward the exit, my flashlight illuminated something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Wet footprints led from the processing area to the main door. Human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, and they were still dripping. I followed the trail with my light, fighting every instinct that told me to run. The footprints led to the time clock near the entrance. Someone had punched in. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. 17 minutes ago, but I had been alone in the building since my shift started at 11. The name on the time card made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped my flashlight. Thomas Kellerman, the worker who had drowned in vat 7 24 years ago. Behind me, the splashing sounds resumed, but now they were accompanied by something else. The wet slap of bare feet on concrete. Moving in my direction, I ran for the exit, not caring about the noise I was making or the equipment I was leaving behind. My keys fumbled in the lock as the wet footsteps grew louder, closer. The metal door finally swung open and I stumbled out into the cold Alaska night, gasping for air that didn't smell like death and chemicals. I never went back to collect my final paycheck. The next week, I heard through the local grapevine that the cannery had shut down again. Equipment failures, they said. Flooding in the processing area. But Murphy, the bartender at the local pub, told me the real story over whiskey and knowing looks. 3 more workers had taken night shifts after me. All of them quit within hours. All of them reported the same things. Wet footprints that appeared from nowhere, splashing sounds from empty vats, and the smell of something rotting just beneath the surface of things. The new owners tried to drain and clean processing vat 7, thinking maybe there was a leak causing the problems. What they found at the bottom made them call the state police. Human remains, old ones, picked clean by 24 years of chemical baths and neglect. But also something else, something the police report called inconclusive. Fresh scratches on the metal walls, deep gouges that could only have been made by fingernails. Human fingernails, made recently. The cannery sits empty again now, slowly rotting back into the harbor. But sometimes, on clear nights when the wind is right, people walking past can still hear splashing sounds echoing from inside the building. And sometimes, they see a wet figure pressed against the grimy windows, staring out at the world it can never rejoin. The locals don't talk about it much anymore, but they still remember Thomas Kellerman, and they remember what happens to people who work alone in that building after midnight. Some jobs, they say, you never really quit. Some shifts never actually end. I moved to Seattle 3 months later, found work at a fish processing plant near the waterfront. Normal hours, day shift only. No overtime, no matter how much I need the money. Because late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I can still hear those wet footsteps following me. Still smell that rotting chemical smell clinging to my clothes. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find wet footprints on my apartment floor when I wake up in the morning. Footprints that are too long and too narrow to belong to anyone living. Footprints that lead from my front door to my bedroom and back again, as if someone has been standing over me while I sleep. The night shift at the cannery may be over, but I am starting to think Thomas Kellerman, his work is far from finished. Story 7, Shadow Climber. I never should have entered the mountain marathon race. But when you reach 41 and feeling like your best years are behind you, you do stupid things to prove you still matter. The race happens every 4th of July in Seward, Alaska. 3,000 feet straight up the mountain, then straight back down. Locals call it organized insanity. Most runners are half my age, but I trained for 6 months, convinced I could finish in the top 100. What I found up there changed everything I thought I knew about what was possible. The morning started normal enough. 200 runners gathered at the starting line on 4th Avenue, stretching and psyching themselves up for the brutal climb ahead. The mountain loomed over us like a sleeping giant, its rocky face scarred by decades of runners scrambling up loose shale and granite. I had studied every inch of that route on maps and videos, memorizing each switchback and danger zone. The gun fired at 11 a.m. sharp. The pack surged forward like a human avalanche, feet pounding on asphalt before hitting the dirt trail that wound up through the alders. I settled into a steady pace, letting the younger runners burn themselves out on the initial climb. The smart strategy was to save energy for the technical sections higher up. 40 minutes in, I was still feeling strong. The trail had narrowed to single file as we climbed above the tree line. The view of Resurrection Bay spread out below us like a postcard, but I kept my eyes focused on the rocky path ahead. One wrong step on the loose scree could end your race with a twisted ankle or worse. That's when I first saw him, the Shadow Climber. He was maybe 50 yards to my right, moving up a section of cliff face that had no trail, no ropes, nothing but vertical rock. At first glance, I thought it was another runner who had gotten lost and was trying to find his way back to the main road. But as I watched, my blood went cold. He was climbing straight up. No equipment, no safety gear, moving across the rock face like gravity meant nothing to him. His movements were fluid, inhuman. Where normal climbers would struggle for handholds and footholds, he flowed upward like smoke given form. I stopped running and stared. Other runners pushed past me, cursing under their breath about people blocking the trail. But I couldn't look away from the dark figure scaling the impossible cliff. He was moving faster than any of us were running on the established path. Way faster. The figure paused and turned in my direction. Even at that distance, I felt his attention like ice water in my veins. He had no face that I could see, just a void where features should be. But somehow, I knew he was looking directly at me. Waiting. My rational mind kicked in. Altitude hallucination. Heat exhaustion. I had been pushing too hard and my brain was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to start running again, focusing on the trail ahead and the steady rhythm of my breathing. When I glanced back toward the cliff, the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched never left. I pushed higher up the mountain, passing other runners who had started too fast and were now paying the price. The air grew thinner and the temperature dropped as we climbed above 4,000 feet. My legs burned and my lungs fought for oxygen, but I was still making good time. Maybe I really could finish in the top 100. The trail took a sharp turn around a massive boulder, and I found myself alone for the first time since the race started. The silence was absolute except for my own labored breathing and the crunch of loose rock under my feet. That's when I heard it. Scraping sounds coming from directly above me. I looked up and nearly lost my footing. The Shadow Climber was there, maybe 20 feet overhead, moving across an overhang that should have been physically impossible to navigate without ropes and anchors. But he wasn't just climbing anymore. He was keeping pace with me, matching my speed as I ran along the trail below. This time, I could see more details. His limbs were too long, joints bending in ways that hurt to watch. His fingers extended like black talons, finding purchase on rock surfaces that looked smooth as glass. And his head moved with predatory focus, tracking my every step. I started running faster, panic overriding the careful pace I had planned. The next section of trail was treacherous, loose shale that could send you tumbling down the mountainside if you weren't careful. But I didn't care about being careful anymore. I just wanted to get away from whatever was following me from above. Other runners appeared ahead, a small group that had been maintaining a steady climbing pace. I caught up to them near a checkpoint where volunteers were handing out water cups. My hands shook as I grabbed a cup and drained it in one gulp. One of the runners, a lean guy in his 30s with Anchorage Marathon printed on his shirt, looked at me with concern. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at how close to the truth he was. Instead, I pointed up at the cliff face above us. "You see anything up there? Anyone climbing off the main route?" He squinted upward, following my gaze. The other runners looked too. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the guy from Anchorage shook his head. "Nothing up there but rock and sky." "Why? You think someone is in trouble?" I looked again. The cliff face was empty, just bare granite stretching up toward the summit. But I could still feel those invisible eyes watching me, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. We resumed climbing as a group, which made me feel marginally better. Safety in numbers and all that. But as we approached the most technical section of the route, a narrow ledge system that required careful foot placement and steady nerves, two of the runners made a decision that chilled me to the bone. They announced they were going to try a shortcut, a more direct line up the face that would save time if they could manage the exposure. I tried to tell them it was a bad idea, that the established route was the only safe way up. But they were young and confident, the kind of athletes who thought they could handle anything the mountain threw at them. I watched them leave the main trail and start scrambling up a steep section of loose rock. They moved well at first, finding handholds and making steady progress. But after maybe 10 minutes, something went wrong. They stopped climbing and just stood there on the cliff face, motionless as statues. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. They weren't moving up or down, just frozen in place like they had been turned to stone. The other runners in our group started getting nervous, talking about whether we should alert race officials or mountain rescue. That is when the shadow climber reappeared. He materialized on the cliff face near the two stranded runners, moving with that same impossible fluidity I had witnessed before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Other dark shapes began emerging from cracks and crevices in the rock, flowing upward like liquid shadow given form. They surrounded the two runners, and suddenly all of them vanished. Gone, just gone, like they had never been there at all. The remaining members of our group stood in stunned silence. Someone suggested we were all suffering from altitude sickness, that we were hallucinating from oxygen deprivation. But I knew what I had seen was real, and I knew those two runners were in serious trouble. We made the decision to continue toward the summit, partly because we didn't know what else to do, partly because none of us wanted to admit what we had witnessed. The final push to the top was brutal, a near-vertical scramble up loose rock that left us all gasping and bleeding from scraped hands and knees. But we made it. The summit of Mount Marathon offered a spectacular view of the surrounding peaks and the town of Seward far below. Other runners were already there, celebrating their achievement and preparing for the dangerous descent. Everything seemed normal again, until I realized that several runners were missing. Not just the two from our group who had tried the shortcut. Others who should have reached the summit by now were nowhere to be seen. The race officials seemed unconcerned, explaining that some people took longer on the technical sections and would arrive later. But I had been watching other climbers throughout the race, and I knew which ones were strong enough to make good time. Too many of them were simply gone. The descent was worse than the climb. Racing down loose scree at maximum speed, trying not to think about the 1,000-foot drops on either side of the narrow trail. My legs turned to jelly and my knees screamed in protest, but I pushed through the pain. All I wanted was to get off that mountain and back to civilization. Halfway down, I heard voices calling my name. I stopped and looked around, confused. The voices seemed to be coming from below the trail, from sections of the mountain face that couldn't possibly support human life. But there they were, the two runners from our group who had vanished hours earlier. They were calling for help, their voices echoing off the granite walls. Every instinct told me not to investigate. But these were fellow human beings in distress. I couldn't just ignore them and continue down to the finish line. I left the main trail and carefully picked my way down the steep slope toward the sound of their voices. The voices led me to a narrow ledge system maybe 50 feet below the main route. Treacherous terrain that required technical climbing skills I didn't possess. But I could hear them clearly now, pleading for someone to help them find their way back to the trail. I called out, telling them to stay put while I went for help. But their voices became more urgent, more desperate. They were hurt, they said. They were lost and running out of time. I had to come down and help them now, before it was too late. Against every reasonable instinct, I started climbing down toward their voices. The rock was loose and unreliable, crumbling under my weight as I searched for handholds. Several times I nearly lost my grip and fell, saved only by luck and adrenaline. But I kept going, following the voices deeper into the maze of cliffs and ledges that made up the mountain, this hidden face. That's when I realized the voices were always just out of sight, around the next corner or below the next ledge. No matter how far I climbed, I never got any closer to finding them. And slowly, horribly, I began to recognize that the voices weren't quite right. They had the right words, but the tone was wrong. Too flat, too emotionless, like something was mimicking human speech without understanding what it meant. I stopped climbing and tried to work my way back to the main trail. But the road I had taken down was nowhere to be found. Every direction looked the same, an endless maze of granite and shadow. The voices continued calling, but now they seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Do you know how long I wandered through that stone labyrinth? Time lost all meaning in the perpetual twilight between the towering cliff faces. My water ran out, my energy faded, but somehow, impossibly, I eventually found myself back on the main trail with no memory of how I got there. The race officials said I had been missing for 4 hours. Search and rescue teams had been looking for me, but somehow they never found me in the areas I remembered exploring. According to them, I had simply vanished and then reappeared at the same spot, like I had never left the trail at all. The 2 runners who had tried the shortcut were never found. Official cause was listed as a climbing accident, their bodies lost in the maze of crevices and drop-offs that honeycombed the mountain. But I know better. I know what took them. I never ran another race. Never went back to Alaska. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed in my suburban home 2,000 miles away, I can still hear those voices calling my name. Still feel invisible eyes watching me from impossible heights. And sometimes, when I look out my bedroom window at the darkness beyond, I see a familiar shape moving across the brick wall of the house next door, flowing upward like smoke, waiting for the right moment to finish what had started on that mountain. The shadow climber found me once, and I'm starting to think he is not done with me yet. Story 8. Ghost Ship BaychimoEach. This reappearance of the ship shouldn't have been there. After 70 years drifting through Arctic ice, the SS BaychimoEach was supposed to be a legend, a ghost story told by old sailors in Alaskan bars. But when I saw her through my binoculars that gray October morning in 2001, she was as real as the ice beneath my feet. I was working as a wildlife photographer for National Geographic, documenting polar bear migration patterns north of Barrow. The assignment was routine. Track the bears as they moved across the pack ice, capture their behavior as climate change altered their ancient routes. What I found instead changed everything I thought I knew about the Arctic. The BaychimoEach appeared like a mirage against the endless white horizon. Her hull was dark against the ice, listing slightly to port but still afloat in a channel of open water that shouldn't have existed. The ship looked exactly as she had in the 1930s photographs. A steel cargo vessel with a distinctive funnel and wheelhouse, her name still visible in faded letters across her stern. But the BaychimoEach had been abandoned in 1931 when pack ice trapped her crew near Cambridge Bay. For decades, Inuit hunters and Arctic explorers had reported sightings of the ghost ship, always drifting, always empty, always just out of reach. The last confirmed sighting was in 1969. Most experts assumed she had finally broken up or sunk, yet here she was, sitting in the ice like she had been waiting for me. My satellite phone had no signal, and my GPS showed coordinates that placed me 200 miles from the nearest land. The ice shelf beneath my feet stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by that impossible channel of dark water where the BaychimoEach sat motionless. I approached cautiously, my camera ready. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The ship's metal hull should have been rusted through after 7 decades in Arctic conditions. Instead, it gleamed with a patina that looked almost fresh. Ice formations around the waterline were geometric, too perfect to be natural. The silence was absolute. No wind, no creaking metal, no sound of water lapping against the hull. Even my footsteps on the ice seemed muffled, as if the entire Arctic was holding its breath. That was when I noticed the footprints. Fresh boot prints led from the edge of the ice to the ship's lowered gangway. The prints were crisp in the snow, as if someone had walked this path within the hour. But according to my instruments, I was the only human being within 300 miles. I followed the footprints up the gangway and onto the BaychimoEach's deck. The metal felt warm beneath my boots, even through thick soles designed for Arctic conditions. Steam rose from the deck plates in thin wisps, and I could hear the distant hum of machinery that should have been silent for 70 years. The ship's superstructure towered above me, portholes dark but somehow watchful. I made my way toward the wheelhouse, camera documenting everything, trying to maintain the professional distance that had served me well in 15 years of wilderness photography. But when I reached the main deck, I found evidence that someone else was aboard. A coffee mug sat on a crate near the port rail, still steaming. Next to it lay a leather-bound logbook, open to an entry dated that very morning. The handwriting was careful, old-fashioned, written with a fountain pen in blue-black ink. The entry read, October 12, 2001. Ice conditions stable. Visitor approaching from southeast. Preparations complete. The waiting is almost over. My hands shook as I photographed the page. Who could have written this entry? How had they known I was coming? And what preparations were they talking about? I called out, announcing my presence, but my voice seemed to vanish into the Arctic air without echo. The ship remained silent except for that persistent mechanical humming, like a heart beating somewhere deep in the hull. The wheelhouse door stood open, revealing an interior that defied everything I knew about the BaychimoEach's history. The brass instruments gleamed as if recently polished. Charts covered the navigation table, marked with courses through ice fields that shouldn't have existed. And sitting in the captain's chair was a heavy winter coat, still warm to the touch. But it was the ship's log that made my blood run cold. The official record showed daily entries stretching back not just months, but years. Decades. The handwriting changed periodically, suggesting different authors, but the entries themselves told an impossible story. The BaychimoEach hadn't been abandoned in 1931. She had been continuously operated by a rotating crew of men whose names appeared nowhere in maritime records. According to the log, the ship served a purpose that went far beyond cargo transport. She was a monitoring station, tracking something the entries referred to only as the deep migration. Page after page described coordinates, temperatures, and ice thickness measurements, all related to movement patterns beneath the Arctic Ocean. The most recent entries were disturbing. They described accelerating changes in the deep migration, suggesting that whatever lived beneath the ice was becoming more active. The final entry, dated 3 days before my arrival, contained a single chilling sentence. Surface contact imminent. Recommend immediate evacuation of observation posts. As I photographed the log, footsteps echoed from somewhere below deck. Heavy boots on metal stairs, moving with purpose. Someone was coming up from the ship's interior, and I was trapped in the wheelhouse with nowhere to run. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, camera ready, expecting to see whoever had been living aboard this ghost ship for the past 70 years. Instead, I heard my own voice calling from the main deck. Not similar to my voice. Not someone who sounded like me. My exact voice, speaking words I had never said. Hello? Is anyone there? I am a photographer from National Geographic. I was hearing myself from 20 minutes earlier, when I had first boarded the ship. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The BaychimoEach wasn't just trapped in ice. She was trapped in time. The ship existed in some kind of temporal loop, replaying events over and over, collecting visitors who became permanent residents in her endless cycle. I understood now why the log contained decades of entries from different crews. Every person who had ever found the BaychimoEach had become part of her complement, doomed to repeat their arrival infinitely while the ship drifted through the Arctic, serving whatever purpose her original builders had intended. The footsteps below deck started again, and this time I recognized the pattern. They matched exactly the sounds I had made while climbing aboard. Somewhere in the ship, its interior, another version of myself was exploring the lower decks, photographing evidence of the deep migration, slowly discovering the truth about the BaychimoEach's real mission. But what was the deep migration? I found the answer in the ship's cargo hold. The space that should have contained trade goods and supplies instead housed monitoring equipment decades ahead of anything I had seen before. Sonar arrays, seismic sensors, and instruments I couldn't identify lined the walls. But it was the central display that showed me what the BaychimoEach had been watching for all these years. The screen showed a three-dimensional map of the Arctic Ocean floor. Vast caverns stretched beneath the ice, connected by tunnels that formed a network spanning thousands of miles. And moving through those tunnels were shapes that defied classification. They were massive, organic, and unmistakably intelligent. Creatures the size of whales but with a structure that suggested technology rather than biology. The deep migration was exactly what the name implied, an annual movement of beings that lived in the deepest parts of the Arctic Ocean, following routes established long before humans ever reached the polar regions. The Baychimo had been built not as a cargo ship, but as a monitoring station. Her crew had been tasked with tracking these creatures, documenting their behavior, and ensuring they remained in the deep waters where they belong. But according to the most recent data, the deep migration was changing. The creatures were moving closer to the surface, their ancient patterns disrupted by warming ocean temperatures and melting ice. The ship's sensors showed them rising from trenches that had contained them for millennia. And they were directly below me. The sonar display lit up with movement. Dozens of massive shapes were ascending through the water column, drawn by something that the instruments couldn't identify. But I knew what it was. The Baychimo herself was the beacon. Her 70 years of drifting a signal to the creatures below that the surface world was ready for contact. The ship began to list more heavily to port. Ice around the hull cracked with sounds like gunshots as something enormous surfaced beneath the Baychimo. The deck plates vibrated with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. I ran for the gangway, but it was gone. The ice shelf had pulled away from the ship, leaving me stranded aboard a vessel that was no longer floating in normal water. Through the gathering Arctic twilight, I could see the ocean around the Baychimo glowing with bioluminescent patterns that moved with alien intelligence. The ship's intercom crackled to life, broadcasting my own voice from earlier in the day. The ship shouldn't have been there. After 70 years drifting through Arctic ice, the SS Baychimo was supposed to be a legend. I was trapped in the loop now, another observer added to the Baychimo's eternal crew. But unlike the previous visitors, I understood what was happening. The ship wasn't just monitoring the deep migration. She was part of it, a bridge between the surface world and the ancient intelligence that lived beneath the Arctic ice. As the creatures rose around us, their bioluminescent signals creating patterns of communication I was only beginning to understand, I realized that the Baychimo's real mission was about to begin. For 70 years, she had been waiting for the right moment, when climate change and human activity had weakened the barriers between the deep ocean and the surface world. That moment had arrived. The Arctic Ocean began to glow with lights that had never been seen by human eyes. Shapes longer than city blocks moved beneath the ice, their presence registered by instruments that had been recording their approach for decades. And aboard the Ghost Ship Baychimo, a crew of temporal prisoners watched as first contact with Earth's oldest inhabitants finally began. I am still here, documenting everything, adding my own entries to the ship's log. Every day, I watched the deep migration grow stronger, more organized, more ready to reclaim a world they inhabited long before humans evolved. The photographs I took will never reach National Geographic. My equipment, like everything else aboard the Baychimo, exists in the temporal loop that keeps the ship functioning across decades. But the creatures below don't need photographs to know about the surface world. They have something better. They have us, witnesses who can show them everything they need to know about humanity through our own memories and experiences. The Baychimo drifts on, carrying her crew of displaced observers toward a future where the Arctic Ocean will no longer be empty ice and water. Soon, the deep migration will reach the surface, and the world will discover that the polar regions were never as uninhabited as we believe. When that day comes, remember that you heard it here first, from the ghost ship that was never really abandoned. The Baychimo was always exactly where she needed to be, waiting for the right moment to complete her true mission. The waiting is almost over. Story 9. 7 days in Talkeetna, I watched my wife Janet buy groceries at Nagli's store on Tuesday morning, which would have been perfectly normal except Janet had been dead for 6 months. She moved through the aisles with mechanical precision, selecting items we used to buy together, her face completely blank as she stared through me like I didn't exist. My name is Carl Morrison, and I've lived in Talkeetna for 18 years. I moved here from Anchorage after my divorce, looking for the kind of small-town peace you can find in the city. Population 800, where everybody knows everybody, and the biggest excitement is usually drunk tourists trying to climb Denali without proper gear. But during the first week of October 2003, our quiet little town became ground zero for something that defied every law of nature I thought I understood. It started on Monday when Betty Franklin saw her son Tommy at the post office. Nothing strange about that, except Tommy had died in Iraq 3 months earlier, and Betty had received his flag-draped coffin at Ted Stevens Airport in Anchorage. She told everyone who would listen that Tommy looked exactly like he did before deployment, wearing his old flannel shirt and Carhartt pants, but his eyes were wrong. Empty, like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. Most people figured Betty was having a grief episode. Losing a child in a war can break your mind in ways that take years to heal. But when I saw Janet picking up milk and bread like she had done every Tuesday for the 10 years of our marriage, I knew Betty wasn't hallucinating. Janet moved with the same careful precision she had always used, reading labels and checking expiration dates. But when she turned toward me in the cereal aisle, those familiar green eyes that had looked at me with love for a decade showed no recognition at all. She studied my face for maybe 30 seconds, tilted her head slightly like she was trying to remember something important, then walked past me toward the checkout counter. I followed her outside, calling her name, but she climbed into a pickup truck I had never seen before and drove away toward the forest. The license plate was covered in mud, and the vehicle disappeared around a bend before I could get a clear look at the driver. Janet had been killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on the Parks Highway 6 months earlier. I had identified her body at the morgue, planned her funeral, and spent every day since trying to figure out how to live without the woman who had been my anchor for 15 years. But there she was, shopping for groceries in our hometown like death was just a minor inconvenience. I drove straight to Chief of Police Mike Henderson's office and told him what I had seen. Mike had known Janet personally, had attended her funeral, had even helped me carry her casket to the gravesite. But when I described seeing her at the store, his expression shifted from sympathy to concern about my mental state. Mike suggested I talk to Dr. Sarah Chen, the town's only psychiatrist, about what he called delayed grief reactions. He had seen it before in other widowers. He said, "The mind creates what it needs to see in order to cope with unbearable loss." But that evening, Mike called me at home with an apology and a story that changed everything I thought I knew about grief in reality. He had seen his own father walking down Main Street, wearing the same fishing vest and baseball cap he had been buried in 4 years earlier. Mike, his dad had died of a heart attack while salmon fishing on the Susitna River, and Mike had been the one to find his body slumped over in their boat. Yet there was his father, walking with that familiar slight limp from an old logging injury, heading toward the river like he was going fishing one more time. When Mike called out, his father stopped and turned around, but his face showed no sign of recognition or emotion. Just a blank stare that lasted maybe 10 seconds before he continued walking toward the water. Mike followed him to the riverbank, but his father had vanished completely. No footprints in the mud, no sound of a boat launching, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. By Wednesday morning, half the town was reporting similar sightings. Dead relatives appearing in familiar locations, performing routine activities with mechanical precision. They all shared the same characteristics: perfect physical accuracy, emotionless behavior, and the tendency to disappear when directly confronted. But Wednesday brought a new twist that made the situation infinitely more disturbing. People started seeing duplicates of living residents. Mary Peterson saw herself standing in her own front yard, wearing different clothes but otherwise identical in every detail. The duplicate Mary was motionless, staring at the house like she was trying to remember why she lived there. When the real Mary approached, the duplicate turned and walked away with slow, measured steps. Tom Bradley encountered his own double while walking his dog near the railroad tracks. Both versions of Tom were walking identical golden retrievers, but the duplicate's dog was perfectly obedient while Tom's real dog whined and pulled away from the approaching pair. By Thursday, almost everyone in Talkeetna had either seen a duplicate of someone they knew or heard from reliable witnesses that their own duplicate had been spotted around town. The phenomenon was no longer isolated incidents that could be explained by grief or stress. Something was creating perfect copies of our friends, family, and neighbors. But for what purpose? I started keeping a log of sightings, trying to find patterns that might explain what was happening. The duplicates appeared most frequently near the edges of town, close to the forest and the river. They performed simple, repetitive actions but never spoke or attempted complex interactions. And they all shared that same empty expression, like sophisticated robots programmed to mimic human behavior without understanding its meaning. But the most disturbing pattern was their increasing frequency. Monday had brought 1 or 2 sightings. By Thursday, we were seeing dozens of duplicates throughout the day, and they were becoming more lifelike with each appearance. Friday morning, I woke up to find Janet standing in our kitchen, making coffee exactly the way she had every morning for 10 years. She was wearing the blue bathrobe I had buried with her, the one with coffee stains on the left sleeve from mornings when she was running late for work. Her hair was styled the same way it had been on the morning she died, pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized the small scar on her forehead from a childhood accident. Every detail was perfect except for her eyes. Those green eyes that had watched me shave every morning, that had rolled with amusement when I told bad jokes, that had filled with tears when the doctor told us we would never have children, now stared at me with the emotional depth of painted glass. I tried to speak to her, but she ignored me completely. She finished making the coffee, poured 2 cups like she always had, then set them on the table and walked out the back door. I followed her into the yard, but she had vanished the moment she stepped outside. The coffee was real. I drank both cups, and they tasted exactly like Janet's coffee, strong with just a hint of cinnamon. But the experience left me shaking so badly I had to call in sick to work. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Janet was buried and found her gravestone undisturbed. The flowers I had placed there the previous week were still fresh, and the ground showed no signs of disturbance. Whatever I had seen in my kitchen wasn't my wife returning from the dead. It was something else wearing her face and mimicking her behavior with perfect accuracy. Friday evening brought the revelation that explained everything and made the situation infinitely more terrifying. I was having dinner at the Roadhouse when I noticed that maybe half the customers looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. They were perfect duplicates of people I knew from town, sitting at tables and eating meals with mechanical precision. Their conversations were muted, and their facial expressions never changed from that same blank neutrality. But scattered among the duplicates were the real residents of Tahkeetna, looking confused and frightened as they recognized copies of themselves and their neighbors throughout the restaurant. We were sharing space with perfect replicas of our own community, and the replicas were increasing in number with each passing hour. That's when I realized what was happening. Something was studying us, creating detailed copies to understand human behavior and social structures. The duplicates weren't trying to replace us or harm us. They were reconnaissance, gathering information about how we lived, worked, and interacted with each other. But reconnaissance for what purpose? Saturday morning provided the answer when the duplicates stopped pretending to be passive observers. I woke up to find my house surrounded by copies of people I knew from town. Janet was standing in the front yard, along with duplicate versions of our neighbors, friends, and coworkers. Maybe 30 perfect replicas arranged in a loose circle around my property, all staring at my front door with that same empty expression. They weren't threatening or aggressive. They just stood there, perfectly still, like they were waiting for something to happen. When I looked out the window, every duplicate turned their head toward me in perfect synchronization, tracking my movement from room to room. I called Mike Henderson, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried several other friends and neighbors, but nobody answered their phones. The town felt abandoned except for the duplicates, who seemed to be everywhere I looked. I decided to drive to the police station, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over normally, but something was wrong with the electrical system. When I opened the hood, I found that several wires had been disconnected with surgical precision. The duplicates had disabled my vehicle while I was sleeping, trapping me in a house surrounded by perfect copies of everyone I cared about. But as the day progressed, I noticed that the duplicates were changing. They were becoming more animated, showing subtle expressions and natural movements that had been absent before. The blank stares were being replaced by curiosity, confusion, and what looked almost like awakening consciousness. By Sunday afternoon, some of the duplicates were speaking to each other in low voices, having conversations that sounded almost normal except for their stilted rhythm and unusual word choices. They were learning to be human by observing and mimicking the real residents of Tahkeetna. But the most disturbing change was in Janet, his duplicate. She had started looking at me with something that resembled recognition, tilting her head and smiling in ways that reminded me of my real wife. She was becoming more convincing with each passing hour, developing personality traits and mannerisms that were eerily accurate. Sunday evening, the phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun. I woke up Monday morning to find all the duplicates gone. The ones surrounding my house had vanished overnight, leaving no footprints or evidence they had ever existed. My truck started normally, and phone service was restored throughout the town. But when I drove into town for supplies, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Several people I encountered seemed slightly different than they had been the previous week. Subtle changes in mannerisms, speech patterns, or facial expressions that might have been my imagination or might have been evidence that some of the duplicates had replaced the originals. There was no way to tell which of my neighbors were real and which were sophisticated copies that had learned to impersonate human behavior with perfect accuracy. The official explanation, when anyone bothered to ask, was mass hysteria brought on by seasonal depression and isolation stress. The few residents who tried to report the incidents to state authorities were dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking. But I kept detailed notes of everything I had experienced, including photographs of some of the duplicates that showed clearly visible differences when compared to pictures of the real people. The evidence was compelling to anyone who had lived through the week of doubles, but meaningless to outsiders who hadn't to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Most disturbing was the realization that Talkeetna might not have been an isolated incident. I started researching similar events in other small communities and found scattered reports of mass sightings involving duplicates of local residents. The stories were always dismissed as hoaxes or mass hysteria, but the patterns were too consistent to be coincidence. Something was conducting systematic studies of human communities, creating perfect copies to understand our behavior and social structures. Small towns like Talkeetna were ideal testing grounds because they were isolated, close-knit, and unlikely to receive serious investigation from outside authorities. I left Talkeetna 6 months after the duplication event, moving back to Anchorage and eventually to Seattle. But I never stopped wondering which of my former neighbors were real and which were replacements that had learned to mimic humanity with disturbing accuracy. And I never stopped wondering whether the Janet duplicate had been destroyed along with the others, or if she was still out there somewhere, living a life based on 10 years of stolen memories and learned behaviors. Sometimes I see her in crowds, wearing that familiar blue bathrobe or the green sweater I bought her for our anniversary. But when I try to approach, the figure always disappears into the crowd before I can get close enough to see those telltale empty eyes. The duplicates may have left Talkeetna, but I think some of them are still out there, scattered throughout the country, practicing being human while serving purposes we can to comprehend. And every time I meet someone new, I find myself looking for subtle signs that they might be something other than what they appear to be. Because once you've seen perfect copies of people you love, you never stop questioning whether anyone around you is real. Story 10. Shapeshifter of Sitka. The thing I saw in the Tongass wasn't supposed to exist, and I'm the only person alive who can prove it happened. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been a park ranger in Southeast Alaska for 18 years. I've tracked black bears through dense rainforest, rescued lost hikers from mountain peaks, and spent countless nights alone in the wilderness. I thought I knew every sound, every shadow, every creature that calls the Tongass National Forest home. But what I encountered 3 miles up the Beaver Lake Trail in September 2023 changed everything I believed about the natural world. It started with a missing hiker report. Rebecca Torres, 26 years old from Portland, had been camping alone near Beaver Lake for 4 days. Her family expected her back on Tuesday, but by Friday morning, nobody had heard from her. The Coast Guard had spotted her orange tent from the air, still pitched beside the lake, but there was no sign of Rebecca herself. I hiked in at first light with my partner, Sarah Chen, expecting a routine search and rescue operation. Maybe Rebecca had gotten turned around on one of the unmarked trails, or taken a fall and couldn't to make it back to camp. We've done hundreds of these operations over the years. Most of them ended with finding the missing person within a few miles of their last known location, usually embarrassed but unharmed. The trail up to Beaver Lake cuts through some of the thickest temperate rainforest in North America. Sitka spruces that are 6 feet across and 200 feet tall, their branches draped with moss that hangs down like curtains. Devil's club with thorns that will slice you open if you're not careful. And everywhere, the sound of water dripping from the canopy overhead, even when it's not raining. We found Rebecca's campsite exactly where the helicopter had spotted it. Her tent was zipped shut, sleeping bag still laid out inside, backpack hanging from a bare rope strung between 2 trees. Everything looked normal except for one detail that made my skin crawl. There were massive paw prints in the soft earth around the tent. Bare tracks, but bigger than any I'd ever seen. The front paws were nearly a foot long, with claw marks extending another 6 inches beyond the pad. Sarah started photographing the tracks while I examined the campsite more closely. Rebecca's hiking boots were sitting outside the tent, laces still tied. Her water bottle was half full on the picnic table. A paperback novel lay open beside it, bookmark still marking her place on page 127. Everything suggested she stepped out of her tent for just a moment and never came back. But that is when I noticed something that didn't make sense. Mixed in with the bear tracks were human footprints. Bare human feet, unusually large, with toes that seemed longer than normal. The prints led away from the campsite toward a game trail that headed deeper into the forest. Sarah radioed our location to headquarters while I followed the mixed tracks. Bear prints and human prints, side by side, heading into the densest part of the Tongass. The trail wound through groves of ancient cedar trees, their trunks so massive that 10 people holding hands couldn't reach around them. Fog drifted between the trees, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. That is when I heard the sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a low, rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite human speech. Like someone trying to talk with a mouth full of gravel. The sound echoed off the tree trunks, making it impossible to tell which direction it was coming from. I drew my bear spray and called out, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking if anyone needed assistance. The forest went completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no water dripping from branches. Even the ever-present hum of insects stopped. In 18 years of working in these woods, I never experienced such absolute quiet. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I continued following the tracks for another quarter mile before the trail opened into a small clearing. Ancient stumps from long-dead trees created natural seats around the perimeter, and in the center was a circle of stones that looked like it had been arranged by human hands. But what caught my attention was what lay scattered around the fire ring. Pieces of Rebecca's clothing, her red flannel shirt torn into strips, her hiking pants shredded as if by massive claws, and mixed in with the fabric were bones. Not human bones, but the remains of deer and smaller animals, all cracked open to get at the marrow inside. I was photographing the scene when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around expecting to see Sarah catching up, but instead found myself face to face with the largest brown bear I ever encountered. It stood about 50 yards away at the edge of the clearing, watching me with an intelligence that seemed almost human. This wasn't the typical behavior of a wild bear. No huffing or jaw-popping or other warning signs. Just calm, calculating observation. The bear was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when standing upright, with dark brown fur and a massive shoulder hump. But what made my blood run cold were its eyes. They weren't the small, dark eyes you expect on a bear. They were larger, more expressive, and they held awareness that no wild animal should possess. I slowly reached for my radio to call Sarah, but as soon as I moved, the bear began to change. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog and shadows. The bear seemed to be getting smaller, its proportions shifting in ways that defied anatomy. The thick fur appeared to be retracting into the skin, revealing patches of pale flesh underneath. The massive head began to narrow, the snout shortening, the ears becoming less prominent. Within minutes, what had been an 8-foot brown bear had transformed into a man. He was tall and lean, maybe 6.5 feet, with long dark hair and weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. He was completely naked, seemingly unbothered by the cold September air. But the most disturbing thing about him were his eyes. They were the same eyes I'd seen on the bear. Too intelligent, too aware, like he could see straight through to my soul. The man looked at me for a long moment, then tilted his head back and let out a sound that was part human scream and part animal roar. The vocalization echoed through the forest, and I heard answering calls from multiple directions. There were others out there, others like him. I fumbled for my bear spray, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the safety. The man watched my panic with what looked like amusement, then began walking toward me with a fluid, predatory gait that was completely inhuman despite his human form. That is when Sarah's voice crackled over my radio, asking for my location and status. The sound seemed to snap the man out of whatever trance he'd been in. He stopped advancing and cocked his head, listening to the radio chatter. Then, without warning, he dropped to all fours and began transforming back into bear form. The change was faster this time, skin sprouting thick fur, limbs extending and thickening, face elongating into a snout full of yellow teeth. But as the transformation completed, something went wrong. The bear that stood before me wasn't quite right. Its proportions were off, like someone had tried to recreate a bear from memory and gotten the details wrong. The legs were too long, the head too narrow, the fur patchy in places where human skin still showed through. The malformed bear looked at me one last time, then turned and crashed into the undergrowth, disappearing into the fog-shrouded forest. I ran back toward Rebecca's campsite, crashing through Devil's Club and stumbling over fallen logs in my panic to reach Sarah. She found me 20 minutes later, sitting beside Rebecca's tent, hyperventilating and unable to form coherent sentences. The official report listed Rebecca Torres as missing, presumed dead, victim of a bear attack. We found more of her clothing and some blood evidence, but never recovered a body. The case was closed after a month of searching, another tragic reminder of how dangerous the Alaska wilderness can be for unprepared visitors. But I know what really happened to Rebecca Torres, and I know it's going to happen again. The nightmares started about a week after the incident. Always the same dream. I am back in that clearing, watching the bear transform into a man. But this time I can see Rebecca. She is sitting by the fire ring, very much alive, watching the transformation with fascination rather than fear. In the dream, she looks at me and smiles, and I can see that her teeth are too sharp, her eyes too bright. Then I wake up, and I can smell wood smoke in my bedroom even though I don't have a fireplace. I started researching everything I could find about shapeshifters and transformation legends in Alaska Native cultures. The Tlingit people, who have lived in southeast Alaska for thousands of years, have stories about Kushtaka, creatures that can take both human and animal form. But those are usually described as otter people or seal people, not bears. The more I dug, the more I found accounts of similar encounters throughout Alaska's history. Trappers in the 1930s reporting bears that walked upright and seemed to understand human speech. Miners during the gold rush who swore they'd seen men transform into wolves. Even recent reports from hunters and hikers who described animals that behaved in ways that defied natural explanation. Most of these accounts were dismissed as tall tales or the products of isolation and harsh conditions. But I'd seen it with my own eyes. The transformation was real, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't alone. I requested a transfer to a different park, but my supervisor denied it. Said I was one of their most experienced rangers and they needed me in the Tongass. So I kept working the trails around Sitka, but I was never alone in the forest again. There were always signs that something was watching me. Footprints that appeared overnight beside my cabin. Trees that had been stripped of bark in patterns that looked almost like writing. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear that same rumbling vocalization echoing through the darkness. The breaking point came 3 months later when another hiker went missing. This time it was a local man named David Keller, an experienced outdoorsman who knew the Tongass as well as I did. He'd gone on a solo camping trip to Indian River, about 10 miles south of Sitka. When he didn't return, his wife called us in for another search and rescue operation. I found David's campsite in perfect condition, just like Rebecca's had been. Tent still standing, gear neatly arranged, no signs of struggle or animal intrusion. But the massive bear tracks were there again, circling the camp in a pattern that suggested the creature had been watching for hours before making its move. This time, I followed the tracks alone. Sarah was dealing with a medical emergency at another location, and I couldn't wait for backup. The trail led deeper into the rainforest than I ever ventured, following old growth ridges and game paths that weren't on any map. After 2 hours of hiking, I found them. There were 5 of them in the clearing, all in human form, sitting around a fire that burned with an unusual blue flame. 3 men and 2 women, all naked, all with that same unsettling intelligence in their eyes. And sitting with them, looking perfectly comfortable and unharmed, was David Keller. He saw me approaching and stood up, walking toward me with a calm smile. When he spoke, his voice had a strange resonance to it, like there were multiple people talking at once. He told me that Rebecca was fine, that she'd chosen to stay with him rather than return to the world of concrete and steel. He said they were the original inhabitants of this land, the ones who had been here long before humans arrived with their machines and their need to conquer everything they touched. David explained that they weren't monsters or supernatural creatures. They were simply a different kind of human, one that had learned to live in harmony with the natural world by becoming part of it. The transformation ability was a gift, he said, passed down through generations of people who had chosen the forest over civilization. He offered to show me. All I had to do was sit by their fire, drink from their cup, and let the change begin. I would keep my human consciousness but gain the strength and senses of the forest's apex predators. I would never again feel fear or loneliness or the crushing weight of modern life. For a moment, standing in that clearing surrounded by beings that shouldn't exist, the offer was tempting. The stress of my job, the isolation of living alone in a remote Alaskan town, the constant worry about budget cuts and bureaucratic politics all seemed insignificant compared to the freedom these creatures offered. But then I remembered my oath as a park ranger, to protect and preserve the wilderness. Yes, but also to serve the people who came to experience it. Whatever these things were, they were predators, and humans were their prey. I told David the first needed time to think about his offer. He nodded understandingly and said they would wait for my decision. The others around the fire watched me leave with expressions that were both patient and hungry. I hiked back to town and filed a report that listed David Keller as missing, presumed dead, victim of a bear attack. Just like Rebecca Torres, just like dozens of others over the years who had ventured too deep into the Tongass and never returned. But I also did something else. I started keeping detailed records of every strange encounter reported in the area. Every unexplained animal sighting, every hiker who claimed to have seen something impossible, every piece of folklore and legend passed down by the Tlingit elders. The pattern became clear. These shapeshifters weren't random monsters. They were recruiters, building a community of people who had chosen to abandon humanity and embrace something older and more primal. And they were getting bolder. Last month, I received a call about strange lights in the forest near Blue Lake. When I investigated, I found a group of Seattle tourists who swore they'd seen a man transform into a massive raven and fly away into the canopy. The week before that, a fishing guide reported watching a woman emerge from Sitka Sound and shed what looked like a seal skin to reveal human form underneath. The shapeshifters of the Tongass are real, and they not hiding anymore. They revealing themselves to more people, extending their invitation to anyone who is tired of modern life and wants to return to something more primitive and powerful. I could report what I know to my supervisors, but who would believe me? I could quit my job and leave Alaska, but that would mean abandoning innocent hikers and campers to creatures that view them as potential converts or prey. So I stay. I patrol the trails and investigate the missing person reports and file paperwork that attributes disappearances to bear attacks or equipment failures or simple human error. But I also watch for the signs, and when I find evidence of shapeshifter activity, I do what I can to warn people away from those areas. Because I know that David Keller and Rebecca Torres are still out there in the deep forest, living as something between human and animal. And every month, their numbers grow as more people accept the invitation to transform and join their primitive community. The offer they made me still stands. I can feel their presence sometimes when I'm alone on the trails, watching from the shadows between the ancient trees. They patient, and they know that someday the isolation and stress of my job will wear me down enough that their alternative will seem appealing. But until that day comes, I'll keep doing what I can to protect the people who come to experience the wilderness of Southeast Alaska. Even if it means keeping secrets that nobody would believe, and facing creatures that aren't supposed to exist. The shapeshifters are real, and they waiting in the fog-shrouded depths of the Tongass National Forest. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in Southeast Alaska and you encounter a bear that watches you with too much intelligence, don't assume it's just another wild animal. Run. And whatever you do, to listen when it starts to speak. Story 11. What swims beneath the thing that followed my boat through the inside passage was not a whale. And the moment I realized it could think, I knew I was already dead. I am a charter captain out of Juneau, Alaska. Have been for 18 years. I know these waters like the veins on the back of my hand. I have seen humpbacks breach 20 feet from my bow, orcas hunting in packs, gray whales migrating south in the fall. I have navigated through storms that turned the ocean into a churning nightmare and fog so thick I could barely see my own deck. I thought I had seen everything the inside passage could throw at me. I was wrong. It started 3 weeks ago. I was running a solo trip, moving my boat from Juneau down to Petersburg for winter maintenance. No passengers, no crew, just me and 42 feet of steel and fiberglass cutting through calm water. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, the kind of day that makes you remember why you love this job. I was 8 miles south of Point Retreat when I first saw the shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a cloud passing over the sun. But the sky was clear. The shadow was in the water, directly beneath my boat, massive and dark. I have seen whale shadows before. This was not that. It was too big, too long, stretching back beyond my stern and forward past my bow. I leaned over the rail and tried to make out details, but the shape had no definition. It was just darkness, solid and dense, moving in perfect sync with my boat. I checked my sonar. Nothing. The screen showed the bottom 50 feet below, scattered fish returns, but no large object directly under me. I adjusted the settings, switched frequencies, even rebooted the system. Still nothing, but when I looked over the rail, the shadow was still there, keeping pace. I throttled up, pushing the boat to 15 knots. The shadow matched me exactly. I cut the engine and let the boat drift. The shadow stopped moving too, holding position beneath me like it was tethered. My heart started hammering in my chest. This was not animal behavior. Animals do not do this. They do not match your speed perfectly. Do not stop when you stop. Do not stay centered beneath you like they are studying you. I tried calling the Coast Guard on the radio. I got as far as describing what I was seeing before I realized how insane it sounded. A shadow under my boat that was not on sonar. They would think I was drunk or having a breakdown. I switched the radio off and decided to just keep moving. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion, a quirk of the water temperature or salinity. I have heard of stranger things, but it stayed with me for the next 40 miles. Through channels and around islands, in deep water and shallow, the shadow never left. It was always there, perfectly centered, perfectly matched to my speed. And the longer I watched it, the more I started to notice details. The shape was not uniform. It had structure, ridges or segments running along its length. And at what I assumed was the front, there was something that might have been a head, wider than the rest of the body, with depressions that could have been eyes. By the time I reached Petersburg, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie up to the dock. The moment the boat stopped moving, the shadow disappeared, just vanished, like it had never been there. I stood on the deck for 20 minutes, staring down into the water, but it was gone. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Exhaustion, too much coffee, not enough sleep. I checked into a motel and tried to forget about it, but 2 days later, another captain called me. His name was Tom, an old-timer who ran whale-watching tours out of Juneau. He said he needed to talk to me about something weird, something he did not want to put on the radio. We met at a bar in Juneau, and he told me his story. 3 weeks ago, while running a tour, he saw a massive shadow under his boat. Bigger than any whale, not showing up on sonar, moving in perfect sync with his vessel. His passengers did not notice because they were all watching a pod of humpbacks on the starboard side. But Tom saw it, and it scared him so badly he canceled the rest of his tours for the week. I asked him if anyone else had seen it. He nodded and pulled out his phone. He showed me messages from 6 other captains, all describing the same thing. Massive shadows, no sonar returns, perfect synchronization with their boats. All the sightings happened in the last month, all in the inside passage between Juneau and Ketchikan. And there was something else. Every captain who saw the shadow reported feeling watched. Not just observed, but analyzed, like something was trying to understand them. I felt my stomach turn cold. This was not a hallucination. This was real, and it was happening to multiple people. Tom leaned close and told me that he had started asking around, talking to old-timers and native Tlingit fishermen. They had stories going back decades. Shadows in the water that followed boats, shapes too large to be real. The Tlingit had a name for them, Kushtaka, but not the land otters from the traditional stories. These were something else, something older that lived in the deep channels and only came up when they were curious about the surface world. I wanted to dismiss it as legend, but I could not. I had seen the shadow myself. I knew it was real. Tom told me to be careful, to avoid running alone if I could, and to never stop moving if I saw the shadow again. He said one captain, a guy named Paul, had cut his engine to get a better look at the shadow beneath his boat. That was 2 weeks ago. They found his boat drifting near Admiralty Island, engine off, no one aboard. Paul was never found. The Coast Guard ruled it a man-overboard incident, but Tom did not believe it. He thought Paul saw something, leaned too far over the rail, and something pulled him in. I should have stayed on land after that conversation. I should have sold my boat and found a new line of work. But I have bills to pay and a daughter in college who needs tuition money. 3 days ago, I took a charter job. A marine biologist from Seattle wanted transport to Tracy Arm to study glacial calving patterns. Easy money, a day trip there and back. I figured I would be fine as long as I stayed alert and kept the engine running. We left Juneau at 6 in the morning. The biologist, a woman in her 30s named Dr. Sarah Chen, spent most of the trip on the boat taking notes and water samples. I stayed in the wheelhouse, eyes locked on the water. For the first 3 hours, everything was normal. We saw seals, sea lions, a few eagles. The water was calm, the sky clear. I started to relax, thinking maybe the shadow phenomenon had passed, whatever it was. Then, 20 miles into Tracy Arm, I saw it again. The shadow appeared directly beneath us, massive and dark, stretching the entire length of my boat and then some. My breath caught in my throat. I throttled up, trying to outrun it, but it matched my speed perfectly. Dr. Chen noticed the change and came back to the wheelhouse, asking what was wrong. I told her to look over the rail. She did, and I watched her face go pale. She asked me what it was. I told her I did not know. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the water, but the shadow did not show up in the images. Just clear green water and refracted sunlight. She tried filming it. Same result. Whatever this thing was, it did not register on cameras. Dr. Chen went quiet for a long time, staring down at the shadow. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. She said she had been studying reports of unusual sonar anomalies in the inside passage for the past 5 years. Objects that appeared on deep water sonar but vanished when boats got close. Shapes that moved in ways that did not match any known marine life. She was part of a research team investigating the possibility of undiscovered megafauna in Alaskan waters. They had theories, tentative classifications, but no proof. Most of her colleagues thought she was chasing myths. But now, staring down at the shadow beneath us, she knew she had been right. She told me the ocean is not fully mapped. We know less about the deep sea than we do about the surface of Mars. And the inside passage has channels that drop thousands of feet, trenches and underwater canyons that have never been explored. Something could be living down there. Something large and intelligent enough to avoid detection. The shadows might be them coming up to investigate us, trying to understand what we are and why we keep moving through their territory. I asked her what we should do. She said we needed to get to shallow water. Whatever these things were, they only appeared in deep channels. If we could get into water less than 100 feet deep, we might lose it. I turned the boat around and headed back toward Juneau, pushing the engine as hard as I dared. The shadow stayed with us, but I noticed something new. It was getting closer to the surface. I could see more detail now. The ridges along its back, the way its body undulated in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And the head. I could definitely see a head now, wide and flat, with deep indentations that looked too much like eyes. Dr. Chen was taking notes, her hands shaking, mumbling about the need to document this. Then she said something that made my heart stop. She said the shadow was not just following us. It was hurting us. She pointed at the chart plotter. Our course had changed. I was steering southwest, heading away from Juneau and toward deeper water. But I had not touched the wheel. My hands were locked on it, holding our heading steady. Yet the boat was turning anyway, slowly, as if something was pushing us from below. I grabbed the wheel hard and tried to correct course. The boat resisted. It felt like trying to turn against a strong current, except the water around us was calm. I throttled down, then up, trying to break whatever was controlling us. The shadow beneath us rippled, and I felt a vibration through the hull, a low-frequency hum that rattled my teeth. Then the boat responded. It turned hard to port, almost throwing Dr. Chen off her feet. We were heading straight toward a narrow channel between two islands, a passage I knew dropped to over 1,000 feet. I cut the engine completely. The boat coasted forward, momentum carrying us into the channel. The shadows stayed beneath us, but now I could see others. 3 more, maybe 4, rising from the deep water around us. They were circling, massive dark shapes that made my boat look like a toy. Dr. Chen was crying now, her notebook forgotten, just staring at the water. She whispered that we had gone too far, seen too much, and now they were not going to let us leave. I tried the radio. Dead. No static, no signal, just silence. I tried my phone. No service, even though we were well within coverage. It was like something was blocking all our communications, isolating us. The shadows tightened their circle. I could see them clearly now, see the way they moved with purpose and coordination. They were not animals, they were something else. something intelligent and ancient and utterly alien. Then one of them surfaced, just for a second, breaking the water 20 yards off our starboard side. I saw a mass of dark, slick skin, smooth and featureless. No fins, no eyes that I could see, just a body that seemed to absorb light. It sank back down without a sound, and the circle of shadows closed tighter. Dr. Chen grabbed my arm. She said we needed to get in the water. She said if we stayed on the boat, they would eventually tip us, and we would drown trapped inside. But if we got in the water on our own terms, maybe we could swim to shore. I looked at the islands flanking the channel, maybe 300 yards away. We were both strong swimmers. It was possible. I started pulling out life jackets, but then I saw her face. She was staring at something behind me. I turned and saw it. The largest shadow had moved directly beneath us, and it was rising. The boat lurched upward. I grabbed the rail as the deck tilted 30 degrees. Water poured over the stern. Dr. Chen screamed and grabbed a cleat. The shadow lifted us higher, and I could feel the immense power beneath us, the weight of something that could crush my boat like aluminum foil if it wanted to. Then it stopped. We hung there, suspended at an angle, the boat groaning under the strain. I looked over the rail and saw it. The thing was just below the surface now, its body pressed against the hull. And I finally saw what it was. It was not a whale. It was not anything from this world. The body was segmented, dozens of plates or sections that moved independently. The head was wide and flat with deep cavities that were not eyes but something else, something that sensed in ways I could not understand. And the color, it was not black. It was the absence of color, a darkness so complete it seemed to pull light into itself. Looking at it hurt, like staring at a hole in reality. Then it let us go. The boat dropped back into the water with a crash that knocked me to my knees. The shadows pulled back, circling at a distance. My engine started on its own, rumbling to life without me touching the ignition. The boat began moving forward, steering itself toward open water. The shadows escorted us, one on each side, one behind. They guided us out of the channel and back into the main passage. After 10 minutes, they simply vanished, sinking into the depths and disappearing. Dr. Chen and I did not speak for the entire trip back to Juneau. When we docked, she gathered her equipment and left without a word. I have not heard from her since. I called Tom and told him what happened. He said I was lucky. He said Paul probably tried to fight them, tried to escape. And that is why they took him. But we submitted. We let them move us, and they decided to let us go. He told me to quit, to get off the water before they changed their minds. I am writing this from my boat. It is tied up at the dock in Juneau, and I am trying to decide if I should listen to Tom, his advice. But I keep thinking about what I saw, about the way those things moved with purpose and intelligence. They were not attacking us. They were testing us, and I think they found us wanting. I think they decided we were not a threat, or maybe not interesting enough to keep. But here's what terrifies me. Last night, I had a dream. I was underwater, surrounded by darkness, and I could see them. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving through the deep channels beneath Alaska. And I understood, somehow, that they have always been there. Long before humans came to these waters, before the first boats, before the first settlements. They have been here, watching, waiting, existing in the cold depths where light never reaches. And now, for reasons I cannot comprehend, they are coming up, investigating, learning about us. This morning, I found wet marks on my deck. Circular impressions, each one 3 feet across, arranged in a pattern. They were not there when I went to bed. The dock was locked. No one could have gotten onto my boat. But something did. Something came up from the water and walked across my deck while I slept. I am leaving Juneau today. I am going to sell my boat and move inland, somewhere far from the ocean. Because I know now that the shadows are not just in the inside passage. They are everywhere, in every deep channel and trench, watching every boat that passes overhead. And some of them, for reasons I will never understand, have decided to take a closer look at the world above. I just hope I did not do something during that encounter that made them more curious. I hope they forget about me and move on to someone else. But I do not think they will, because last night, in my dream, I saw something that I cannot forget. I saw myself underwater, surrounded by them, and I was not drowning. I was breathing. I was becoming one of them. And I know that was not just a dream. It was a message, a promise. They are not done with me yet. And now the snow closes in, the path gone behind us. If you felt the cold tonight, subscribe and turn on notifications. More stories are waiting just beyond the tree line. Drop your own strange experiences or your location in the comments. It's how we keep the whispers alive. Midnight Whispers isn't just a story, it's a thread in the dark that connects us. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your back to the wind.